La force d'une société, c'est les connexions créées au-delà des différences. Se connecter nous fait grandir en tant qu'individus et nous transforme en tant que collectivité. Ensemble, on est plus solide. C'est ce qu'on fait de mieux. C'est ce qui nous pousse à aller toujours plus loin. Car les connexions, c'est ce qui rend notre monde plus fort. On connecte, on accepte.
Hi everyone, welcome to the New Face of Queer Lit reading. This is a Metonymy Press event in collaboration with the Violet Hour and Fierté Montréal. I'm Eli Tareq El Bechelany-Lynch. I'm a queer Arab writer living in Jojage. I currently have a book on pre-sale that is being published with Metatron Press and will be out in September of this year called Not Body. And then I will have a book published in 2021 in the fall by Metonymy Press called The Good Arabs. And yes, I did choose two publishers with similar names, both from Montreal, just to confuse everyone. And I want to thank Helen and Kama and Hazel for being here today. And I'll just start off the event by introducing everyone. So Helen Chau Bradley is a writer, musician, and arts administrator living in Jojage, Montreal. Their work has appeared in Arteris, Carte Blanche, Cosmonaut Avenue, Entropy Magazine, Maisonneuve Magazine, Rice Paper Magazine, and elsewhere. Personal Attention Roleplay, a collection of short fiction, will be published in 2021 by Metonymy Press. Find her book reviews at Notes of a Crocodile on Instagram. Kamala Mackerel is a Montreal-based Mauritian-Canadian multidisciplinary artist, educator, community arts facilitator, and literary translator who works within and across performance, photography, installations, textiles, digital art, and literature. They have exhibited and performed their work internationally, and their writing in English, French, and Creole has appeared in publications both online and in print. They have lived in far-flung places such as Pune, India, and Peterborough, Ontario. Some Femme is their first book. And Hazel Jane Plante is a queer trans librarian, cat photographer, and writer. In a previous life, she co-founded a micropress, co-edited a little literary journal, co-hosted a podcast, and released lo-fi albums under the name Sparse. Little Blue Encyclopedia for Vivian, which recently won a Lambda Literary Award for transgender fiction, is her first novel. She currently lives in Vancouver on the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So thanks everyone for being here today. Yeah, this is like kind of one of the first panels I've done over Zoom, so just trying to figure out how this works. And
I'm really excited about this though. I'm super stoked.
Okay, well maybe I'll start us off with a kind of like easy question, or sort of easy question. So we're talking about the new face of queer lit, but queer lit is obviously like very new and very old at the same time. And there are plenty of queer and trans writers to you know, look to write from. And I was just wondering who those people were for you, and what do you take like from them moving forward with your own work? What kind of things do you leave behind? What do you decide to change? And obviously these writers don't have to necessarily be queer or trans explicitly, because obviously those are kind of newer terms that we use, and queer ancestors aren't always so obvious, but yeah, I'm just curious who those people are for you all. Should I name, or should people just decide? to talk?
I feel like it can be a bit hard to self-facilitate in this, especially because we're trying to mute ourselves while not speaking.
Right. Okay. Well, do you want to go, Helen?
Sure. I guess I could name, you know, a million writers probably just because I read about 1 million times more than I write. But I guess some people who would come to mind are Alexander Chee and Renee Gladman and maybe Xu Miao Jin. And those writers are all not particularly similar to each other necessarily, and I came to them at different times, but I think that maybe especially Renee Gladman's work has made me think about how, you know, queer writing can be queer like in its very structure, or, you know, the ways in which the writing is shaped, as opposed to just like queer writing being about queer people, which I mean, it certainly is. But there's something in her work that's endlessly fascinating to me in terms of, I guess, just the queer architecture of her writing. And she also writes a lot between and through different genres, which I think is a very queer thing as well. And I guess we'll probably get into that later on the panel, because it's one of the things that we're going to discuss, this idea of like moving through genres or layering genres. I sort of see that as like very queer in and of itself. And then I guess someone like Alexander Chee, who writes slightly more straightforward fiction and nonfiction, has been important to me in more of a, maybe more of like an identity kind of way, where he's also a mixed race, European, East Asian queer writer, and he is a bit of an elder, not being a whole lot older than me, but just being somebody who came up in the American literary scene when there basically weren't any other well-known or hardly any other published sort of East Asian queer writers at all. And I think it was, yeah, I think just it was meaningful for me to read his own essays about that experience and to read about how he has navigated that. And he also brings a lot of his own like political activism background into his writing, which I think can be another element of what queer writing can be, that it brings in like one's political activism, perhaps, if not overtly, then maybe in more subtle ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, his work has felt really important to me as well, so definitely get it. A bit different, but do you want to answer, Hazel?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, as far as this question goes, I mean, it's one that I kind of think for me is very related to whatever project I'm working on, I think more so. So there are certain kind of influences and folks who will kind of come to the surface with certain projects. So I'd say with like Little Blue Encyclopedia for Vivian, I think, I don't know, I was thinking more broadly of kind of like translit, I guess, in general, which I don't know, there was a lot more out there now than there was at the time. And even after I'd finished a draft, I read some things. I remember reading like In Fierce Femmes and Notorious Liars, Kacheng Thomas' book. I was like, oh, this has a thing that's super similar to my book about this like trans femme militia. Do I cut that out of my book? But I think for some of that stuff, there's just a thing in the air, right? Like I feel like I know a lot of folks who have talked about things like that. So it's kind of like, it's interesting seeing things bubble up. So for me, some of that stuff would be, especially Topside Press was a really important press, I think. Just, you know, a whole host of different writers who are doing different sorts of things, but vary from the ground up, everyone there being trans. They're one of the 3 publishers I sent my manuscript to, and I didn't realize they'd gone out of business by the time they'd received my my actual manuscript. But I think some of it for me is like, I don't know, a person who I think, I don't know, who I don't think a lot of people necessarily bring up a lot is Derek McCormack, who's a gay writer out of based in Toronto. Especially a book called Dark Rides, which is his first book, which kind of one of the ways that it's unified, it's kind of about, you know, being young and being gay, and it's kind of unified through this idea of like gaps or absences, which I think was like one of the main kind of unifying things in my book as far as the TV series and then the other story goes. And I think that's kind of one of the things that, you know, broadly speaking in queerness, like there tends to be like sort of like absences or gaps or whatever, or, you know, just grief more broadly written and things like that too. Stuff like Frank Ocean was like another really big person too. I mean, who is not a writer, but like his specific like coming out letter that he put on Tumblr, I think it was, for the narrator of my book, I think was just like profoundly important as far as like being someone who he's like always kind of shied away from being out in the public, I think, which is kind of fairly similar to the narrator of my book in a way, and helped to kind of like find, I think, the voice for her. Yeah, and there are other kind of writers like, I don't know, Phyllis Webb and like Bill Bissett and stuff like that, who if you really know their work, then you'd see stuff in my book related to them, I think. The project I'm working on now, definitely Gertrude Stein is super important because there's tons of repetition in the songs that I'm trying to write. Like the narrator in the second half of my book is this kind of like semi-famous trans songwriter slash musician, like trans rock star or whatever. So like that's been like really important as far as like in repetition. It's kind of like 2 novellas that kind of layer on top of each other. 20 years old, 46 years old, and kind of trying to do this thing. I don't know, there are a bunch of other ones like Zammy, I would say, Audre Lorde more broadly writ, the erotic. I just finished writing this like 6,000 word sex scene, which is like pretty different than what's in my previous book, but I'm really trying to like show pleasure, I think, specifically like pleasure through bodies for like trans folks and queer folks. That's kind of become like increasingly like deeply important to me. I think that's probably enough. I will mute myself now.
Well, do you know Teddy Geiger? Do you know who she is?
Can you say again?
Do you know Teddy Geiger?
Oh, musician?
Yeah, she's like a trans.
Yeah, she came out a while ago or whatever.
Yeah. And she like mostly writes songs now. And like when you were saying about your book, I was like thinking about her. Because like
I mean, I think there are a few folks or whatever who I'm kind of like thinking through or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's been pretty fun to write.
Yeah.
And I have a band as well, so I'm hoping to like record songs in this
cool.
EP in conjunction.
Do you want to go, Kamal?
Yes, thank you. Oh, thank you, everyone. Yeah, for already, I'm just like, my mind's just like moving in so many places, but also thank you for such a great question. It's interesting because now I am at that point. It's only last week when I had this realization. Actually, last week, for the first time, an advanced reader copy went to a queer Mauritian reviewer, and I had this moment of realizing, oh, this is the first time that a Mauritian is reading this book. And, you know, and then it just like, I just kind of like spiraled into like all those questions around like, what is the lineage that I'm writing into? Because I think that was when it actually sunk in for me in terms of Mauritian literature, that actually, you know, that I know this is going to be the first Mauritian queer book, so to speak, like in the sense of like the first openly out there from a queer trans identified writer who is writing like a queer trans history and poetics into a book. But also there isn't, you know, like, yeah, I know some writers who explored queer content in Mauritian literature, but they were like straight writers writing about queer content. So yeah, it really opened up that question for me, like in a way that I hadn't thought. I think because I wrote this piece, this book, this entire work happened in Canada, and I think there's like a clearer lineage of where I was writing from or what I was writing into in a Canadian context that was less present in a Mauritian context. But now I'm realizing this is a very much a Mauritian book in that sense. But I will say I do want to talk quickly to mention Ananda Devi. She's a Mauritian writer, and I think for the reason why I talk about her is because I think she was the most influential writer for me in terms of how to write the island, in terms of, and she had an approach, I think that sort of like femme writing of the island, actually writing the femme body onto the island. She does that, and she extricates it, right, in terms of all the violent gender dynamics, specifically within the context of like more traditional Hindu Mauritian culture. But I think the way she does that, and I read her since I was a teenager. Like the first time I read her, I was like 16 or 17, and I still read all of her stuff even now. And I think in many ways, and she writes in French, I'm writing in English with this book, but I think in many ways, her writing of the women's body specifically onto the island was what influenced me and very much shaped my writing or my approach to writing the queer femme body onto the island. So that was, I would say, like one influence in terms of that. And it's interesting because the other part of it is because we'll talk about this more later, but the creative process of writing this book, like it started off as a spoken word piece and a performance more so. I didn't think about it as a book, until what, a year ago-ish or so. And I think that part was interesting because in terms of the creative process itself, there are only 8 poems in the book. It's very grounded in the traditions of the spoken word. And I think in terms of that, I'm definitely writing in terms of such a multiple lineage, right? Because the spoken word, the open mic as a space, as a queer space, as a technique of storytelling, right? And I think in terms of that, all those years of open mics and poetry nights and all the live spoken word or performance events, I think very much influence, because I started doing spoken word. I had already moved into Canada. I saw queer and trans writers of color first performing it, and then I was like, oh my god, that's a thing, and at the time I didn't even have a deep sense, my introduction to CanLit is still, I'm being introduced to CanLit, so to speak. Like if you had asked me at the time, and that would be about a decade ago, who are the Canadian queer writers, I wouldn't know. Who are the Canadian writers, other than Margaret Atwood? I knew nobody in that sense. And I think so. I think there's that part of the influence, because that's the thing. A lot of times, I think as queer writers, like the stage is where our voice finds a space. And in that sense, I've been influenced by so many. I think they're all just like, so every single person whom I've ever seen perform in that sense has influenced my work. And in a more, but I think one of the things that I think about a lot, I mean, I do think of the work of Amber Dawn a lot in particular, and Leah Lakshmi Piep's Nasara Masina a lot, because for me, they were also the first contemporary Canadian queer writers they were my introduction, actually. It was the first time I read any more contemporary, but also not so contemporary, right? But, I mean, what is lineage and what is time when we're talking about queer time? Like, how far do we go, right? Because there's always like, you're in your 30s, you're a trans elder, right? Like, so there's the notion of queer time. But I think those two were very influential for me, because that was the first time, Audre Lorde was very influential, but there's a way in which, for me, reading Amber Dawn and reading Leah Lakshmi Piep's Nasara Masina were very much for me the first time that I realized, oh, there's a contemporary, there's something that's more living, right? Those are my contemporaries who live in the time and space, and I think that was very influential. And then that opened the door for and that's when I started like finding out more and more and reading more. And I remember, a few years ago when Topside Press started, that was very, for me, that was my introduction to trans literature. Actually, at the time, I remember a bunch of the girls, of the writers came to Montreal maybe 8-9 years ago to launch each of their books. And that was my first time actually being in a space, actually. Morgan C. at the time had organized an event called Trans Women Writers or something, and that was the first time. It was like Cafe Cleopatra, and that was the first time that I found out there was a trans a publishing house committed to publishing trans writers, and reading Casey Plett, what is it, a Safe Girl to Love. That was my introduction to. That was my first time reading, quote unquote, literature written by trans women specifically.
Yeah, I feel like A Safe Girl to Love was also one of the first kind of like influential trans writers that I read as well. Like yeah, that book really stuck with me for years, like still sticks with me. And just seeing like so many trans characters just kind of do their thing. I think
it's so fucking good. It's really great.
Yeah,
I started rereading it again like last week, and I'm just like, oh, this really is, yeah, it's doing a lot of different things too at once.
Yeah. It's like sitting on my table right now because I was gonna reread it actually. Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna mention Trish Sulla because she's like the person who's feels like my queer ancestor. I don't know, ancestor sounds weird to say because she's alive, and like, I mean, she's older than me, but you know, like not so much. But so my best friend's sister actually gave me Trish's book and had just found it, like wanting in Arabic, and was like, oh, I think you'd like this, like you should read it. And this was like 7 years ago, and it truly, I was like, oh my God, a Lebanese mixed race, is also like, has Irish heritage, is trans, is like writing these beautiful ghazals. And I was like, it truly changed the face of poetry for me. And like what I could imagine being able to write, and like what I could imagine kind of, yeah, I don't know, her work was just like is so amazing. And she's also like a great person and has been so lovely. Like once I met her and kind of was like, freaking out, she was just like so sweet. And so yeah, I feel like her work has really been so influential for me. And also she's so underappreciated, I think, in the like Can Lit world. I've had so many conversations where I'm like, you don't know who Trish Sulla is? Like, go read her now, you must. Because she's just like such a genius, I think. Yeah, I guess I want to move kind of through this question to talk about form and kind of like multidisciplinary approaches to art. I would say widely art, because everyone here has so many different artistic practices, I would say. Like there's Helen and Hazel, you both write and play music. And Kama, you've worked with so many different kind of, like as I said or as you mentioned in your bio, you've worked with so many different kinds of forms and like textiles and digital art, and as you mentioned, spoken word and performance. And I guess I'm curious about like the ways that you've moved through so many forms during your careers, and kind of like blend the line between different forms, and in some ways like queer the form, kind of like you mentioned, Helen, with Renee Gladman's work, that just, it does feel, her writing feels so queer, even if it's not like explicitly talking about a queer instance. The ways that she uses language is so queer in that way. And so I'm curious about all of your relationship to form and your relationship to moving through medium, and you know, why you choose a certain medium at a specific moment, and yeah, how it influences your relationship to like what you're currently working on, what you want to work on in the future, kind of what you've worked on in the past. I guess Hazel, do you want to go? I guess I'll mix around, so I'm not always picking the same person first.
Yeah, I was gonna say someone has to be the top here.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I think it's just like, who wants to go first?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and honestly, like I think about form a lot. I think you know, I think most creative folks think about form a lot. I have pretty much exclusively been doing like constraint-based writing for the last probably like 10 or 15 years. Really super inspired by folks like Oulipo. Like I was chatting with somebody recently and they brought up the Christian book Yenoya, and I think for some of that stuff, for me, it's always the thing of like, how do you use form in a way that doesn't feel like a stunt? And I think that's sometimes can be a really hard thing, right? Like if you're doing constraint-based writing or whatever, particularly. For Little Blue Encyclopedia, that one there, I kind of like, it kind of became like almost a think there's an image in the book somewhere of like peanut butter and chocolate, or like peanut butter and jelly or whatever, kind of coming together to kind of like explain the form of the book. And that's kind of the way that one worked for me. Was I spent about 2 years, it's gonna sound kind of sad, but actually in the end it has a happy ending. I spent about 2 years trying to write a book about a fictional television series, similar to those like 33 1/3 books. Like I was just dipping into the one for J Dilla's Donuts again recently, where it's just, it kind of walks you through an album, or there are ones about television series, there are ones about films, and I was like, I want to do one about a TV series that does not exist and has a lot of characters and actors, some of whom are real in the world, you know, like that kind of thing. And I spent about 2 years working on that, and I was like, I don't know if this is getting me where I want to go to. And I started working on another thing, and then they kind of morphed together, and it became the challenge of, is it possible, I don't know, and that's kind of exciting for me in a way, is it possible for me to interweave this really emotional story with this kind of sort of like quirky television series and make them work together and have it be really funny, but also really sad, and kind of like not give the reader emotional whiplash? Like, how can I do that? And that was like, I think the latter part kind of like helped when I got to finer grain editing, I think, or whatever. But that was kind of my proposition for myself, right? And with the book that I'm working on now, which wasn't one I had in mind even 6 months ago, when people were like, what's your next thing? I was like, I'm not going to write another novel. It's going to be collaborative. I just want to collaborate. I'm tired of working in my own head. And then something started tumbling out around like January, February for me. And I'm probably 3/4 of the way through this like rough draft of a novel. And that one there, yeah, I kind of had this idea of thinking about aging as a thing that I find myself thinking about a lot, as like someone who's trans and thinks about my past differently. Like I think about myself at 20 differently now than I did, you know, before I transitioned, right? And I find that in other folks, and I didn't really see that a lot in literature, so I wanted to be able to kind of like represent that sort of thing. Yeah, and like repetition and like sex and all of these kind of things, and like creative practices, and how does that kind of play into kind of, in a way, kind of how we even become who we are, I think, which might be something we chat a bit about later or whatever, like representation and things like that, like kind of like how do I represent somebody, right? Yeah, so for that one right there, really, and like songs started coming in there, and I had this idea, which I've kind of changed a bit, but this idea of almost like two novellas that kind of like lay over top of each other, almost like a palimpsest, I think, is kind of one of my main sort of ideas of it, where you can kind of still see the 20-year-old structure and certain phrases kind of appearing in the 46-year-old narrative. Yeah, and certain things that kind of like ripple out different ways, right? Like maybe a lover said this at 20 and now this person says this. That kind of thing. Like I'm just kind of interested how we kind of move through time, which reminds me of like, I don't know, I didn't mention this before, but there's a book called Time is the Thing a Body Moves Through by T. Fleischman, which is also like just a super influential queer book by this non-binary writer, which like my next project after this, I think will be deeply influenced by that. Because I'm thinking about a kind of like triptych of essays. But anyway, I will kind of stop there, but I think more about form than I probably should. Yeah, but I mean, it's always the challenge for me of like making it useful and interesting and organic to the project, and not just plugging a thing in there, right? Like I am one of those people who's guilty of having written like dozens of guzzles, and all my guzzles were not great guzzles. Just because it was a very, I don't know, very attractive form for me. But I was like, is it really related to what I'm trying to write? I think that's always the question for me with form. Thanks.
Yeah, I think you're in good company with regards to like nerds who love form. I think we're a bunch of, yeah, it's basically who we are right now. So I really love hearing about people's relationships to form and kind of how they get to it, and how they move from one to another. So I really enjoyed hearing that. Do you want to go, Kamal?
Sure. I mean, I think I'm just going to start by reiterating how amazing a book Little Blue Encyclopedia is. Like, if you're listening right now and you haven't read it, please do. And I think the reason why I'm bringing it up is also this, when we're talking about that notion of form, and Hazel, you just like touched on this, is that's the thing, like a lot of, and that's the thing, I'm also a multidisciplinary artist, so I see a lot of experimental art. And believe me, I don't always get excited about it. Most of the time I don't, to be honest. And there's something for me when you know, like when the experimental form just works. And for me, that's what Little Blue Encyclopedia, that it just, it's so well crafted. And I think that's the thing, because sometimes that's the thing. It's like you get the experiment, but you're like, but what are you doing? And I think it's such a fine balance. And I think it's for me, it was one of the books that plays with forms that I think I think it's mind blowing in that sense. Like, I think maybe I would even say it is the book that plays with form in terms that I've read in my entire life. For me, that's it just comes together, just like I think clearly I'm like fangirling right now, and I'm all like, ah. No, but I think it was really that's how amazing I think it is, and it's so exciting to hear about your future processes and what you're thinking about. And yeah, I'm really excited for you.
Thank you. I'm a bit embarrassed. Can we move on to another?
But you know, one of the things about form specifically, because yes, I do play with form, and I'm also an interdisciplinary artist, that I think I would like say right off the bat, because I struggle with, because a lot of times, because even in terms of the first question, when you ask us, you know, the question of lineage that we're writing into, I talk way more about content or ideas or essence than the actual form. And I think I really struggle with that, because I don't qualify my work as queer in that sense. But I think the reading of my work is framed as queer. And it's something that I've been struggling with, generally speaking, in the arts as well. Just generally speaking, where I was like, actually, because I think my work, for me, yes, in terms of form, it's not, it plays with form compared to what the literary canon has gifted us, or whatever, passed on to us as what counts as like, you know, like, I don't know, like a proper narrative and a beginning, a middle, and an end, to just take that as an example. And for me, my practice more than anything is decolonial, actually. Like, you know, the fact that I play with form, the fact that I have an interdisciplinary practice, and that I'm interested in knowing if I articulate something through, you know, an example that I often give is like, so for example, I had this community-based piece that I did with a bunch of femmes of color. I interviewed 8 femmes of color. And then what I did, I treated the interviews, I selected 50 quotes from the interviews, and then I screen printed those 50 quotes, and then I sewed a textile piece, a textile garment with it, which exists as a 3D piece in itself. And I like to think about it as a zine, but you don't read it off the page. You go around the dress and you read it, because it's basically a garment. And that exists as its own work, but also I can wear that garment, right? But then what if I wear that garment and I do a performance, and then somebody takes a photography of that performance, and then that photography is exhibited, right? Like, where does the work of art start and where does it end? And for me, it's about allowing those multiple points of entry. And that's, for me, that's the part where it's you know, it is a decolonial practice in the sense of like, I am trying very consciously and actively, you know, to move against the singular narrative, you know, the rational colonial narrative, right? Which is always singular, which does not allow us to exist in multiplicities, you know? And I even frame that in terms of trans politics, right? Like in terms of like the Western discourse around transness being that you are trapped in the wrong body, and that, you know, and then through like particular interventions of the state and the medical institutions, and, you know, and then you need to fix that. And then you're supposed to stay there, right? Like even the dominant narrative about transness in the West is that notion of it's a singular narrative. And I think I'm very much pushing against that in my work, generally speaking, which is why I'm like, my voice, you know, like, because I'm interested in the different art forms themselves, but also what happens between each of those forms, right? Because I think that's what I call, that's what creates the hybrid space, or the third space, so to speak. And those are the parts where the absences, right? Like the silent voices, like that notion of what has been hidden, I think can emerge, actually. It's in those third spaces. And it's interesting because in terms of then framing my work for me, in terms of how I play with form, and I was very conscious in terms of Zoom Femme as well as a poetry manuscript. For me, I was really, because it started as a performance. Well, it started as a spoken word piece where I would just be at the mic, you know, with a mic stand, and I would perform the whole thing. And then I was really intrigued by the question, because I used to dance many years ago, and I really wanted to know, how does the poetry dance? If right now I'm at a mic stand, but if I get to move in my body in the space, how do I get to move my body? Like how is poetry embodied if I perform it, right? And that's how the performance got developed. And I went back to dance and stuff like that. And I think in terms of thinking through the manuscript itself, then I really thought about the form as I want the body of the text to perform on the stage, on the page, just like my body performs on the stage. So that's when I started playing with form in terms of like how the poetry is laid out on the page. And that was something that I was very intentional about. And it's interesting because I think a lot of the reading of it is a queer reading, but fundamentally for me, I mean, my queerness is also decolonial, right? Like, yes, it is a queer reading. Yes, it is a trans form, right? Like, it is the transdisciplinary, the transnational, the transgender, right? It's all of this in it, right? But I think I really struggle with the queering of the form, mostly because my experience of it, and that just like my experience of it, is that a lot of times it became something that became reappropriated by whiteness in that sense. Like, you know, like cool younger white queers doing experimental art, queering the art, queering the canon. And, you know, and I really struggle with that. And I think that's the thing. Like, yeah, so my work gets read as queer, but for me, the work is more, above all, the work is decolonial, it's hybrid, it's cosmopolitan. I would rather use those terms. And of course, then it's also queer, but my queerness is hybrid, is cosmopolitan, is decolonial as well. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Yeah, I mean, I think as trans, BIPOC, yeah, I struggle with BIPOC because it's such a broad term, and many people have been on Twitter have been talking about it. And so every time I say it, I'm like, BIPOC, but also asterisk, yes, it's, you know, a big term, etc. But, you know, like for trans people who are BIPOC, it, like, at least for me, and as you said, like, I can't take my transness and my Arabness apart. And so I really like resonate with that, where my work I feel like my work is explicitly trying to be decolonial and in trying to, you know, like work towards that. And like in a continuous way, where I know that from like one work to another, as like things kind of change or move, I'm like moving towards a continuous decolonization within like my queerness and my transness and the written word, but like also when I'm performing it. And I was thinking about when you're talking about like kind of the hybrid form, I was thinking about Dion Brand's The Blue Clerk, because I mean, it's been such an influential text for me, but when she first put it out, there was so much talk about, because basically The Blue Clerk is a book of sort of like prose poetry, but then there's two sides of the page. There's two narrators, and one is the speaker, and one is kind of the pages, the blank pages, or the pages that you don't see. So kind of like the addendums, or like the asterisks, or like this other narrator who kind of looks at what is not spoken and what is not said. And these two narrators, like, they're the same person, but they're not at the same time. Anyways, it's a fantastic piece of work, but she talks as well about her work as a decolonial practice that really kind of got me really excited about moving towards that space with my own work. And, you know, what does it mean to be writing or to be performing or to be making art that doesn't continue to follow the canon, and that actually not just like changes the canon or kind of fights against the canon, but is like, actually, we don't even have to think about the canon necessarily. And what does it mean to be making decolonial work as like a practice rather than just making art? Like, I think sometimes people are like, it's about making the art, but for me, it's often about more than just the thing that ends up on the page. And I guess I'm gonna ask you, Helen, after to give your answer, and then kind of ask everyone to talk about maybe the work with Metonymy that they've either put out or are putting out. Because for me, the book, The Good Arabs, that will be out in fall 2021 is really kind of trying to investigate like what it means to be an Arab and what it means to be good and what it means to be in solidarity with other peoples. And kind of like when I first started writing it, they were kind of like poems, and I was kind of going on a traditional poetry route. And then I realized I couldn't do that. Like I couldn't, with everything that I was trying to do, it didn't make sense to just write, you know, classic kind of verse poetry. I was like, this isn't really getting at everything I want to get at. Like it needs nonfiction, it needs context. If I'm writing this book in Canada and I'm writing about the Arab world, then I need kind of like some space to bring people in, but also what does it mean to be writing it here instead of in the Arab world? And I feel like all that kind of disconnection, all of those like mixed elements like force the work to be hybrid. You know, when our identities are so kind of interspliced and like at odds, but also like communal, I feel like hybridity becomes almost the only way that I can, at least for me, that I can write and that I can, you know, perform. So it kind of ends up being like the only, not solution, but the only thing that is able to come out. But yeah, I don't know what you'd like to say about it, Helen, about hybridity and work and etc.
I really love hearing about the way that all of you think about form. I also think about form a lot, maybe too much. I think sometimes it can stop me from writing if I get too caught up in thinking about what kinds of forms I'm interested in and what kinds of forms I want to inhabit. But I really like what you said about working with constraint, Hazel, because that's something that I have been doing a fair amount. And Kama, thank you for bringing the decolonial lens or approach into it, because I think, yeah, that's such an important thing to consider as, yeah, you know, racialized queer and trans writers and people. I think, yeah, you know, like the writers that I brought up as influences are queer and also are not white, and some of them are based in you know, the US or Canada. And Chiu Miao-jin, who I talked about, was a Taiwanese writer, and I think it was really important for me to read her because it was like one of the first times that I was reading like an East Asian queer writer who was writing from a very unfamiliar context for me. And I, you know, I think I read her books and there was so much in them that I really didn't relate to, and that read in a very almost like unparsable way to me. But I think that was also important in some ways, to read other queer perspectives that I like don't relate to, but sort of just having it wash over me, if that makes sense. I think sometimes people get a little bit fixated on the idea of relatability in literature, and especially maybe around like literature that has to do with identity, or that we think has to do with identity. Often as somebody who, you know, I write a lot of like book reviews online, and I run a book club and stuff, and I often get people who seem to be a bit overly fixated on the idea of relatable narration or relatable characters, or maybe even relatable forms. And I think for me, at least as a reader, it's important for me to read things that are not relatable to me really very much at all, and to still immerse myself in them. It's a bit off topic, I guess, but yeah, I guess with constraint, I actually have a small poetry chapbook coming out with another, you know, sort of queer Montreal publisher, House Press, and all of the poems in that collection were written under great constraint. I took I was trying to learn some languages on Duolingo over the period of a few years, and all the poems are composed from phrases that were generated by that language learning app that I just over time took apart and put back together into various different poems. And that was kind of the only way so far that I've been able to write poetry that I feel open to sharing. So that was kind of my way of getting into the sort of more poetic form, because I find that when I try to just write poetry without constraints like that, I just come up with a bunch of drivel that I really wouldn't wish upon anyone. And then, yeah, I guess my collection that's coming out with Metonymy is a collection of short fiction. And I think I've just like really loved short fiction and short stories ever, you know, for years and years. And I think one of the fun things about short fiction is that, and also conversely, one of the really challenging things about writing a collection of short fiction is that every time I approach a new story, I have to think about the form again. I guess I could write all the stories more similarly, but I think I like to challenge myself that way, and I try to approach each story differently, depending on kind of the feeling that I'm trying to arrive at in the story. I have to figure out like what kind of forms I can use to get to the center of it. And recently, I've been in a writing group with some other people, some of whom write primarily for theater, and that's been really cool because I don't have like a theater performance. Well, I have a musical performance background, but not a theater background. So it was really interesting to read people's scripts. And I think that like got into my head a little bit. And recently I've experimented with writing a story that's told not as a script, but entirely in sort of unattributed dialogue. And that was just really fun to do. And I don't think it's something that I would have tried if I hadn't been, you know, in this writing group with people who were writing a lot of script-like dialogue that I got to read. So that felt fun. I don't know if it's, you know, successful, but it felt good to release myself from this sort of narration that I often write into my stories, and to just like go with a bunch of dialogue and try to make like a whole, hopefully compelling story that way. Yeah. What was your other question?
I think you answered it. Well, I just wanted, if people hadn't talked about their book with Metonymy, I just thought that we should mention them. But you brought up your collection of short stories, so.
Oh yeah, wait, I wanted to say one more thing, because Kama, I really like what you said about, sorry, I'm gonna misquote you now, but the idea of like, how does the poetry move, or how does it relate to the way that you might move through space? And I will say I have seen you perform many times, and it's always really wonderful to see you embody your work. And then I guess Hazel and I are both musicians, and I was just gonna say, like, in terms of embodying writing, like I've only started writing in a more literary way in the past maybe 2 years. And before that, I was primarily writing in terms of writing lyrics for the band that I was in for a long time. And yeah, it's sort of interesting to think about how writing lyrics for a band, I'm automatically thinking about the way that that's going to be projected into a space, and how it's going to come out of me as I'm, you know, playing an instrument and interacting with my bandmates on stage, and how it's going to come through the other pretty loud sounds that we're making. And I sometimes had some reticence around, like, my bandmates would want us to print the lyrics to the songs in, you know, in the tape foldout or whatever. And I often felt kind of nervous about that, because I was like, the lyrics are not, you know, they're not the same on the page as they are when they're part of the sound, or when they're like being embodied on stage. But then again, as a fan of music, I like it when lyrics are available. So. I'll end there.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about everyone's work as like solo work versus kind of the more collaborative work that even as a solo person, but doing collaborative work even with the audience. Because I know Kama, you're kind of, I feel like your work is collaborative in that way, even if it's just you on the stage, which is really great to see. I guess I want to move to a question about self-representation. I think we've all kind of touched on it a little bit already, but I think with queer or trans or BIPOC writers or racialized writers, it's often assumed that any work that we produce is work about us. And I've seen it time and time again, like people getting interviewed where anything, even though it's like clearly fiction, it's assumed that any narrator or the main character is the person who wrote the book. And I guess I wonder how you navigate that within your work. Like, is your work self-representational? Does it kind of look like you representing an authentic self? Does it look like you representing a part of yourself? Is you representing a specific character who looks very different or like who is very different than you? Does that feel like representing yourself? Are you like, this has nothing to do with me, it's not me? And like, is that your kind of feeling about self-representation? Yeah, and how you navigate that kind of then sharing your work, right? Because I think if you're writing for yourself, that's one thing, but then as soon as you share your work, there is an intended audience. There is someone who's going to read it and make assumptions and, you know, see themselves in it, etc. So how you kind of navigate that. You want to go, Hazel?
Sure, I can go. Yeah, that's a question I've definitely been asked in, like, I'd say half of the Q&As or half of the interviews I've done. It's always like, is this based on this or those sort of things? Before I say anything, I will also say that, like, Kama, I saw you when you were out this way as part of like the Femme for Femme performance, and that was just like spectacular. That was so good. So fangirling both ways, just FYI. Yeah, I don't know. This one here, it's a question I kind of feel like, yeah, I keep getting asked it, and I think it's like, it's one answer for like Little Blue, and it's a different answer for the thing that I'm working on right now, I think, in a way. I think I've often been very coy and said the book is fiction, but some of it happens to be true. And I think like as a fiction writer, in a lot of ways, it's like you can't make every single thing up, and a lot of the stuff that is a detail in the book, sorry, a detail in the book is a thing that came out of my life, right? Like there's a reference, for example, to this drummer, like they're trying to start a band. This is a thing from my own life when I was trying to literally start a band called Femme Task Force with all like trans women, and it did not happen. I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna put in my fucking book, it exists. And I just like wrote a song. But there's a detail that they're trying to get this one drummer who, like, I think on a dating site said something like, I'm pretty good at drumming and I'm great at bottoming. And then I messaged this person and it's like, one of these two skills I'm particularly interested in. I don't know. So I feel like little details like that are just the kind of thing that like gives something life, right? Often. I would say with Little Blue, like, I don't know, that one is tricky. I think like the voice of it feels very much like my voice, to be honest, like the actual, that sort of thing, like the feeling of it, I think in a lot of ways. Like I recently wrote this like short story for this like trans smut anthology. And like, and I think it's tender, and I feel like maybe everything I write is going to have the word tender attached to it, and maybe I'm okay with that actually. But I feel like Little Blue, compared to the thing I'm working on now, I'm literally trying to, in some ways, write over top of experiences I have had and write over top of recent and distant trauma, and kind of like rewrite stuff and make it actually like kind of like a better memory for myself. That's kind of part of my enterprise, which seems like a little bit of a tricky kind of alchemy of kind of like actually infusing it with a lot of my own stuff. But I think I'll probably be super coy about what's real and what isn't real, right? Because I think there's like a danger in like just being too open about stuff. And I don't know, I'm just always very wary of that. And for me, like the last thing I'll say is like in some ways, like with writing, I think there's representation, and I definitely do want to show, it's important to me to show characters who are flawed. And that's a thing that I kind of found myself grappling with, is like, I want a narrator who doesn't have perfect language, but how do I convey that without the character seeming, I don't know, without it being really problematic, right? Without perpetuating problematic views, or this person doesn't have perfect language, like maybe they refer to someone in a way that that person would not refer to themselves. But I think like I'm trying to write so the person reading it actually has enough distance to be able to see things the narrator doesn't. And that can be really fucking hard. The last thing I was gonna say though is, I feel like for me with representation, sometimes it's interesting because it allows me to go to places through fiction that I wouldn't necessarily go in my own head. And I'm just like writing a thing and it's like, oh, this other thing is coming up. And in some ways I would say like writing something like Little Blue Encyclopedia and the book that I'm working on right now have kind of expanded me as a human being, which seems like a really lofty thing to say, but often it's like, oh, there was a wall there, and now actually, you know what? There's a fucking handle and I'm opening it up. Like, I don't know, writing about this like trans rock star, I feel like I'm just way more like ridiculously confident in the world, which I'm just like, I don't know if I will carry this through, but it's a really nice thing to be like, oh, actually, that's not me, but it's a part of me, right? And I kind of feel more comfortable kind of like taking that on, right? Like writing Little Blue, I have way less shame about my body, because one of the main characters who I was really thinking through and like working with for like a few years, like really just didn't have that stuff. And I was like, that was profoundly like, I don't know, just profound, affected me in really profound ways. I don't know, I think maybe I answered some of your question.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Okay, I'm muting.
Yeah, I like the idea of like changing with your writing. I feel like it makes so much sense that like one evolves with what they're, you know, what they're creating. What about you, Helen?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I have a real horror of writing publicly about myself. I don't think it's something I'm very interested in doing, at least not in an overt way. I think that's why I used all those constraints to write the poetry pamphlet, because in a way I was kind of like, none of these poems are about me at all. They're generated by a robot. Don't worry about it, you know? I think I'm just sort of digesting a lot of what you just said, Hazel, about your approach to writing fiction and fictional characters. And yeah, I think in my fiction, the people I'm writing will often exhibit characteristics that I exhibit, or they might think about things in a similar way to me, or they might look like me on the outside, but they're not me. And actually the first time I ever read a short story at a live event, and I think it was like the first short story that I really had tried to write since I was like a teenager. This was like 2 years ago. And then it was nice. I was like terrified. It was well received. It's this story about a young queer gymnast. Anyway, but then somebody came up to me at the end of the event and was like, oh, I loved your essay. And I was like, it's not an essay, it's a story. And I was a little bit afraid after that everybody would take all of my short stories as essays, which it's not what I want. But yeah, I think there's something about the sort of fun and terror of inhabiting other characters. And I notice, like, if I'm sort of working through the narrative of a story that I'm writing, or I'm trying to like figure out the characters, because I think often my stories have some kind of relational tension or explosion at the middle of them in various ways, and I get very stressed out, like trying to embody or inhabit the people who I'm writing about, who aren't me, but do contain elements of me. And especially, Hazel, as you say, when I'm writing people who aren't me, who might think about things differently or might say things that are like not entirely appropriate or whatever, trying to write those characters in a way that is not sort of promoting the things that they think or say, or yeah, it's like how much am I responsible for the characters that I write, and then consequently how people are going to read them. Because I think, you know, once you've put something out in public, you can't really control how people are going to read it, and that's pretty scary, but also maybe a little bit liberating. I don't know. Yeah, I think I'm trying to write people right now who maybe are, and not necessarily in a good way, willing to go to lengths that I think I wouldn't feel comfortable morally with going to, but it can be fun to write those scenarios because, you know, it can kind of be like a choose your own adventure, what if I was more like this kind of scenario, without actually having to do those things in real life. Yeah, and I think it's also just important, like, as somebody who is, like, racialized and queer and whatnot, to write like especially in a short story collection, I get to write like a lot of different examples of what like a queer Asian person might be like. And sometimes I worry that all the characters are too similar, and I think I'll probably have to go through the draft a lot once the whole thing is written out to make sure that I haven't accidentally written the same person like 10 or 12 times. But ideally, hopefully in the collection, you do get like a sort of wider array of you know, queer, Asian, diasporic people, like mixed race or otherwise. That's sort of what I'm aiming for.
Yeah, I feel like you and I, Helen, have like talked about this with regards to short stories, but just like that, when the collection of short stories has like the singular voice going through, when they're not trying to like succeeding in differentiating your characters, versus like when that thread is like, you're like, oh no, this is my voice, and I can tell it's my voice continuously through or not my voice, but like the writer's voice or whatever. And the difficulty of like kind of trying to create so many characters that don't all sound like the one same person. And I think you do a good job of that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and I mean, there's some writers who do that intentionally really, really well, like people who write a short story collection and it's all more or less from the same perspective. But I think that's really something that I admire and that I'm not trying to do right now, because I think I'm afraid that it will be repetitive and mundane coming from me.
Yeah, it's well, like the short story collection that I'm thinking of that does that is Lot by Brian Washington, which is an amazing short story collection, and everyone needs to read it. He's like say like in his mid to late 20s, Black queer writer. It's like his debut short story collection, and it's kind of the same character. And there are certain short stories that are clearly the same character, and some that are just a character that is like the main character. But it's so well done. So if you're looking for a short story collection, that one's a really good one. Yeah, Kama, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, it's different for me because I actually do explicitly write from the I. It is a first person narrative, but also even the rest of my work, right? Like my photography based work is always, like my body is always framed in the photography, right? Like I use like, you know, my body is present when I'm as a performer as well. So in that sense, yeah, I would say I definitely bring in the personal into every kind of work that I'm doing. Like a lot of it, like, you know, I talk a lot of like that question of the I, right? Like, and what is the I? And that's also for me part of the decolonial process in that sense, because very much for me, it's the notion of articulating the I as multiple and not the I as singular, right? Like not as a singular voice. In that sense. But at the same time, I think that I itself is so complex, right? Like, so specifically in terms of writing Zomfam, you know, it's because Zomfam kind of like goes back, like the first piece in it is kind of, it's very, you know, there's that biomythography kind of influence. It starts with a birth piece, okay? There's an entire story around the birth of that child, which is written in the I narrative. But so to take that as an example of the story, you know, like there's the relationship that I have to the I, or the relationship that I have to the story, has changed between when I was 6 years old and when I was 14 years old and when I was 17 years old and when I was 24 years old, right? Like even in the process of writing it, right? And this piece is like very family, like, you know, I use the family home as a setting. And one of the things that I realized was that how the narratives that we have about each other actually has shifted through life, right? Like, and for me, the question was more, how do I make space for all those I's to exist, right? Like, so in many ways, yes, it is an I am writing from an I, but at the same time, there are multiple I's in it, right? There are multiple first person moments in this. So in terms of representing the personal, yes, I think there's a way in which I'm representing myself at this particular point, right? Like I'm sure in 2 years, I'm going to read Zomfam and I'm going to feel complicated about it because, you know, like I think Hazel, like you touched on this, and in terms of like, yeah, the process of, yeah, the ways in which you grow, right? Like your sense of self, at least for me, changes as I'm working. For me, it goes alongside, right? Like the sense of self and the sense of the poetic voice or the artistic voice, like both of them are evolving alongside each other. So there's that part of it, but it's interesting at the same time because the notion of representation, right? Like, because I know one of the things that I really struggle with, to take the example of the birth piece, which is the opening piece in Zomfam, I really struggle with it because it's like there are basically 6 stories about my birth, and all of them are true, right? There's a story that I heard from my dad when I was still a child. There's a story that I heard from my mom when our relationship fell apart. There's a story that I heard again when we part, you know, like that. And I kept hearing different stories, and for me, all of them I held as true at that particular moment, right? Like, so, and then there was the moment of like, I remember really struggling around like, there are those 6 stories about my birth, and all of them are actually true. How do I write this? Right? Like, and then, so then if you get to the question of like, one thing that for me, of course, I have no control over how the book is read, right? Like I agree with the way you framed it, Helen, earlier. Like once the book is out into the world, it doesn't belong to me anymore. And I'm super aware of this. At this point, you know, yeah, in about 6 weeks, this book's not going to belong to me anymore. The narrative doesn't belong to me anymore. And I don't know how it's going to be read. But I will say in terms of my own intention, and I've been increasingly saying this, is particularly now that it's starting to be framed as like, you know, like the first Mauritian queer book and stuff like that. And I'm like, but also my story is just one story, right? Like I don't represent all the trans experiences out there. I represent one trans experience, you know, even in terms of Mauritius, I'm just like, it's a small place. It's 1.3 million people, but I'm not representing Mauritius in the sense I'm, you know, like just in terms of my own family history, I'm Indo-African in the sense of like, you know, so I'm in a Black and brown family. I grew up in a Catholic and Hindu family, right? Like that's my story. And there are so many other ways of it. You know, if you're Chinese Mauritian, your understanding of Mauritius and how you lived, and Mauritian culture will be totally different from mine, right? Like, so, and I think that part is important to me. It's like I am what I'm, because a lot of times, probably, you know, Mauritian literature is not what is the most prominent, right? Like it's we, at least in the North American context, right? Like maybe in Francophone literature, it's different. And I think in many ways that there will be a lot of like because I'm already hearing that notion of first, but I'm like, but I'm not representing anything other than my own experience, you know? And that part for me, I think that's going to be a bit of a, that's the part that I have a feeling I'm going to have to keep reiterating, you know, in that sense. I'm like, I'm representing one trans narrative, and hopefully a lot of people are going to see themselves in it, but also other trans people will not see themselves in it. You know, I'm not, and I think it's so unfair to ask of the writer, of the artist, because a lot of times, particularly as marginalized artists, right? Like, because we do have the pressure of representation, right? Like, we're supposed to be writing for the entire community. To start with, it's not one community, it's multiple communities, right? And you can't write for all of them. And I think a lot of time that's unfair, right? Because that's what's expected of us as marginalized writers, is that like we're going to be writing for the entire imaginary community. And yeah, and I don't think, even as somebody who works with, yeah, I work with an I narrative, but that I itself, I think, is multiple, it's hybrid, it's complex, it shifts. But also, yes, I am representing myself, but I'm representing myself, like, you know, as Mauritian, as Canadian, as Indo-African, as, you know, as trans, as femme, as all of those things. But that doesn't mean that this experience is shared with other people who share all those aspects of my identities and experiences.
Yeah, I feel like that's the first is always such a, like for me, I when I think about it, I think of like, it feels like a kind of a marketing ploy, you know? It's like the first of this, and then it's like capitalism, how much can we sell this book? Like, and obviously we're selling books, so like this is the world we exist in. And but yeah, it feels hard for me to think of the first, because it's just like, who are we also not thinking of, right? Like, there's often, when we say the first, there's obviously other people who have written or who might have stories that they weren't able to share as widely. And I kind of like, yeah, like you, like the first kind of narrative is very frustrating. But yeah, it's interesting when you were talking about the stories that your family tells you and the way those stories change. Because for me, in writing The Good Arabs, there's a lot of stories of like the stories my family tells me, and they often shift, or like they're different. They're a bit different every time someone says it, or like certain stories, like I only hear sometimes because only some of my family are willing to talk about certain things. And so then, yeah, I've kind of struggled with like what it means to write truth when the truth is being told, like the truth or the story is being told to you, and then you take that, and it's like, what is the truth within that, you know? Like there's a story of my uncle coming to Canada that I read about. Like, he came as a refugee, and he like, he basically had to take like a boat and a plane and a bunch of ways to get here. And at one point he had like talked to this man on the plane, and they were chatting and they really got along, and my uncle is Lebanese and this man's Egyptian, and they're just like talking. And then when my uncle goes to the checkpoint to go through security, the man who was on the plane with him is actually the man behind the security checkpoint. And so because of that, he barely looks at my uncle's passport, which was not I think it was like a fake passport. And then he kind of just lets him through, and my uncle's like sweating bullets. But because they had that interaction on the plane, it kind of like luckily passed him through easily. And I've tried to represent that based on, you know, the story he's told me. And he only told it to me like 2 years ago. And I was like, why have you never told me this story? It's so great. But then that's part of me, but that's not my story to tell it. Or that's not my story, but he has allowed me to tell it. And, you know, he's shared it with me. So what's the truth in that, you know? But yeah, like you, I also write from the I. But I feel like people often, I think the other thing about writing from the I is people assume there's no craft behind it as well, you know, that we're not fabricating some type of story or some type of narrative or a poem, or, you know, like the assumption is that, you know, it's just like, this is what happened to me, and we're just throwing it on the page, and or like we're just like saying it into the mic, and that's kind of like, you know, and I think it takes away from the craft of like deciding what details to share, you know. For the book Not Bodied that is coming out, a lot of it has to do with my experience with fibro as a trans person, and the way that fibro is very much considered a woman's disorder, but it's always cis women specifically. And so when I was writing that book, like a lot of that book is like letters from my bed, which is like feels very personal to me, but I'm not, but when I share the book, it doesn't feel so vulnerable because I'm choosing which parts to share, you know. I'm not going to rip my soul out and give it to people because that feels uncomfortable for me. I'm choosing the parts that feel okay to share. And I think people just assume that everything is on the page, and that also that anything that I share is therefore like allowed to be pried into, when it's like, I've shared this, you should be satisfied with what I've given you, you know. And I think a lot of people are kind of like, who are queer or trans or racialized, it's like people like, because you've shared an I, they try to dig in deeper into what that means. And I think when you said, Hazel, like the project that you're working on right now, it sounds very like deeply like intimate and kind of like, I'm sure it's hard to write, but I trust also that you're gonna share stuff that you're willing to share, right? And like, but then where does that line end when you're like, actually, this is what I wanted to share. Don't try to pry deeper. Like, why aren't you satisfied with what I've decided to give you and what people think that writers owe them? Which I think is like constantly a question in my brain, because no matter how often people say like, I've given you what I've given you, and like, please be satisfied with that, there's always the question of like, but like, tell me more, which is hard, and like hard to have happen to me and hard to see happen to other people. So I'm just like, just let it be. You know. We have like 10 minutes left, I would say. So I kind of want to end on like more of a fun question, which is like maybe like a mixed question of like what kind of like pop culture or music or things you've been listening to or reading or watching that they don't have to influence your work, but they can. And like the fun aspects you find in writing. I guess you can choose to answer whichever part of that you want. Kind of splicing two questions, but I kind of want to end on a fun point, and like not end in too much of a heavy way. Do you want to go, Kama?
Sure. Oh God, I love questions about pop culture, because that's when I get to come out and say like, I'm the most uncool person ever. I'm just like, ask me about books and I'll tell you everything that I've been reading for the past month and a half. Ask me about what I've been listening to. Well, the same 2 albums that I have been rolling on my Spotify for the past 2.5 years now. Sort of thing. I'm really not in touch with, unfortunately, with like, I only got Netflix a few weeks ago. You know, during the pandemic, like I didn't even have Netflix. That's how I'm like, oh God, each time I log on to Twitter, I have to open the Urban Dictionary at the same time to understand what's happening. So like, I'm really not the best. But I will talk about one moment in popular culture history, because I still listen to. I'm a massive Whitney Houston fan. And there's that one video of hers, of her concert in 1994 in South Africa. And I love going back to that concert, actually. And because there's a point of time where I think she performs I Have Nothing at a point of time. And there's this moment for me, it's like, you know, when I used to dance, when I used to be a dancer, we used to talk about this moment where like the dancer becomes the dance, you know, like as a performer, it's like it's a total loss of the ego, and you because your body is the material, right? Like, and you just become the art, like you become the dance. And I think I listened to this part of the concert a lot because I feel that there's a moment in this piece where you can see it, where as she's performing, like the way I frame it is that she sees God, like really, there's like God descends onto her and onto like the thousands of people who are in this stadium. And I watch this a lot. I go back to this video a lot. It's my one popular culture reference, because I think there's something for me about, there's something about that moment where you become the art and there's an access to the divine. And I think it's something that as a performer, but also even sometimes when I'm writing or working on my other art, I think it's something that I very much aspire to. So this is the one moment in popular culture history that I tend to go back to a lot.
Nice, that's a very good moment. What about you, Helen?
Let's see. I've been watching Unsolved Mysteries by myself at night and giving myself horrible nightmares and like startling awake in the middle of the night and thinking that's somebody's in my apartment kind of thing. I don't really recommend that, but that's what I've been doing. And otherwise, I really like, okay, I'm also a nerd, obviously. I really like stuff about like spycraft and like the Cold War I find really fascinating. And I kind of always have these phases of like, you know, going in and reading a lot about the Cold War from, you know, various perspectives and sort of all over the world kind of thing. But there is this really fascinating podcast that you may have heard that came out recently called Wind of Change, which is just a journalist following this rumor that he hears from somebody who used to work at the CIA that this huge song called Wind of Change by this West German band called the Scorpions, who were like a huge, huge band in the 80s and 90s and are still a huge band today. There's this rumor that their biggest hit, Wind of Change, which kind of became a bit of an unofficial anthem for the end of sort of the fall of the Iron Curtain, that song was actually written by the CIA in order to, you know, spread US hegemony via soft power. And the whole podcast just follows this, it's just this journalist like talking to a vast array of people, some of whom seem to know things, people who were involved with the CIA, people who weren't, people who knew the band. It's really great. It's like a very kind of hybrid type of podcast because there's a lot of layered stories, and often when an episode starts, you're kind of like, why is he talking to this person? Like, what does this person have to do with this rumor? Like, and it's like a great sort of labyrinth of fact and rumor, which I highly recommend. And then because I was listening to that, I got back into listening to my favorite sort of Soviet era Russian band, Kino, you may have heard of, who was, I got a bit obsessed with because the front man was this Korean Russian singer who really rose to prominence around perestroika and became a bit of an icon of the end of the Soviet Union, and then unfortunately died in a car crash right as that era was ending. And those albums are still really, really good. So, Kino, look them up.
I really love hearing everyone's nerdy pursuits right now. It's really good. Yeah, I feel like my current, like more embarrassing pop culture situation is that I'm reading a lot of like YA fiction that I used to read as a teen, but like I'm listening to the audiobooks. And there's a series called The Confessions of Georgia Nicholson that I was listening to that's like about she's like 14 to 16 in this like 10 book series. And I listened to them in like less than a week, and they're just really funny. Like she's just yeah, and she's British, and she just makes up like all these funny terms for like America's hamburger a go-go land. And I just kind of like, I was like, you know, it's like, it's pandemic, things are hard, I'm just gonna like sink into this 14-year-old narrative. So that's kind of what I've been doing. And then the Whitney Houston moment comment that you mentioned like made me think of like my favorite Aretha Franklin moment, which like, cause she wears, like she often wore these like really extravagant coats on stage, like even though she was probably boiling, but she was like, I want to look good and I will wear them. And I really love that kind of like, I really love like the dramatic or like the kind of like the flashy moments that people show, and like the kind of like that confidence. Like I really enjoy seeing the ways that people kind of like and then there was one performance where she came on stage and she just like took her coat and threw it off of herself to be like, hello, I'm here. And I think about that moment a lot, of just like, she decided the coat was not meant for her that night and she just like flung it off. And I was like, that's perfect. Yeah, what about you, Hazel?
It's exciting to hear about all of these. I'm like, oh, these are things I need to look into. I know that Scorpions song very well. It's not one of my favorites, but I'm really excited for that podcast. I will quickly mention like a band or a couple of songs by a band, and then a TV series. The TV series, which is not the greatest TV series of all time, but it's pretty good, is the TV series called Homecoming, which I watched because in season 2, Janelle Monáe is in there. And I have a character in the novel I'm writing right now that is this femme guitar genius, where like if it ever gets made into a film, I want the character to be played by Janelle Monáe. This like really rad character who I like, who hasn't really even appeared yet, but who I love so much, and like I want her to open her mouth, even though she doesn't say a lot. She's really just, I love her. And yeah, she's Janelle Monáe crossed with Roland S. Howard, who's this kind of guitar genius who was involved with like Nick Cave for a number of years and stuff like that, and went solo. And then the band Wares. There's a band called Wares out of Edmonton. Cassia Hardy is the main person in that band, and there are especially 2 songs from this new album they had that came out a few months ago. This album called Survival, which is such a great album. It just the one song is called Tall Girl, which is very much about this kind of like invisible trans girl, like looking to this visible trans girl and saying like, I wish I knew you better, and kind of looking back and being like, it was before she kind of came out as trans, and just how important this person was to her in her life, which is the thing I don't think I've ever really heard in a lot of songs before. And then a song called Surrender into Waiting Arms, which is just very much about like, I don't know, like sexual pleasure and not experiencing shame and stuff like that. And it's just like, and those 2 I think of in conjunction to like, I don't know, some of the stuff that I'm trying to do, but also just like really fucking great. Like loud, but pretty. I don't know, when I was trying to do a band before, I wanted the idea of defiant beauty was going to be like the defining thing. It's like femme and butch, and it's just like, it gets really loud and then it gets really quiet, and it's just like all of those things. So I feel like this band is doing that thing that I wanted to do. Wares. I will stop there.
Is it Wares like W-E-A-R-S?
No, W-A-R-E-S, like we're selling our wares.
Ah, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Them up after.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess this is like the kind of the end. Thank you all. This has been such a nice conversation, and you've all said such amazing, smart, insightful things. And I feel like the conversation went by really quickly, so I just want to thank you all for being here today. And yeah, I guess we'll end now.
La force d'une société, c'est les connexions créées au-delà des différences. Se connecter nous fait grandir en tant qu'individus et nous transforme en tant que collectivité. Ensemble, on est plus solide. C'est ce qu'on fait de mieux. C'est ce qui nous pousse à aller toujours plus loin. Car les connexions, c'est ce qui rend notre monde plus fort. On connecte, on accepte,